Welcome to Three Questions with Motion Point. I'm your host, Dominic Ditterbide, and today I have the absolute pleasure of talking with Rebecca Ray. She's a senior analyst and director at CSA Research. CSA Research is a firm focused on global business specifically. Rebecca, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really ready for this. I get to talk about something I love, so this is great.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. Well, let's just get right into it. Why don't we?
Okay.
Rebecca, regarding global research, right, globalization and international marketing, what are some of the latest trends and research findings in the realm of business globalization that you would like to share with us?
Okay, first I'd like to define it to make sure that we're all on the same page, so to speak. So when we talk about business globalization, we're talking about the language, the translation localization piece, but we're also talking about everything that has to work within a company for global expansion to work. So your customer support department, all of the back-end IT infrastructure, all of those things that need to work together to actually ensure that international customers have at least as good an experience as domestic customers. So when I'll be answering and talking to you today, I'll be talking about that big picture, including language, but not necessarily just that. So I think when I thought about this earlier today, I think one of the big things is, and this applies to stuff that's going on in all industries, people are trying to figure out, okay, how do we apply generative AI or tools or whatever to global expansion? Could it help us, do better with our business cases? Could we calculate ROI in better ways for the markets we're going into? So I think that's a big one. I think the other thing is that people are trying to figure out how to better organize their staff around supporting international customers. So as you and I know, Dominique, I mean, we're never going to have C-level executives, right, for globalization. It just isn't going to happen. But
Right.
I think there's more and more realization, no matter how big a company is, that you've got to have your staff, stepped in with the tools they need to do that. So that whole business globalization thing is really a horizontal function, and so it's going to touch everybody, even if people are only going into a couple markets. So organizing staff, I think, is the second thing. But I think the most important thing, at least from our perspective in the research that we're seeing, is that similar to when China really it became obvious that they were an economic power and going to be in a huge market that everybody wanted a piece of. It really forced a lot of companies coming in from the outside to do a better job internationally and to do a better job with their translation and localization and even, adapting their products. So I think that what's going to happen is that the large language models are going to do some of the same thing, right? Because if those models can only handle, say, French and German and Spanish and English and Chinese and a few other languages, it's not going to work, over time. So I think that's going to push teams within a company to actually work more with localization teams internally and with companies like yours. Because who has the data? The data for language sits with your company, it sits with your customers, it sits with internal translation teams, and other teams are going to need access to that data and how to use it. And so I think that's going to be a big one. But I'll stop there. But that's what we're seeing on our side, talking to companies and around the world.
Well, I really like that. I think to the core of it, when you're trying to translate something, you mentioned it's a horizontal, type of dynamic where it's expanding across all departments in all facets of a business unit, right, of a company. And at the end of the day, if you want to do this correctly, I believe that's really the heart of it, because you don't want to make multilingual or customers, clients that speak other languages, people that speak and prefer in other languages, feel alienated or feel like second-class citizens. And to truly get that done, it has to be something that touches all the departments. So I really like that piece. I wanted to highlight
That's
that
right.
a little bit more.
Whether or not
Well,
they like it.
yeah, yeah. And I think if it's good, let's move on to the next one. So,
Okay.
Rebecca, let's see. Do you have any best practices that you would like to share that you're seeing when expanding business into international markets?
Yeah, and I do want to say that a lot of what we're talking about today also applies to companies or organizations that that have multicultural audiences within their own domestic market. So again, we're talking global
Yeah.
and international expansion, but you know, as we know, Chinese and Spanish speakers in the U.S., Turkish speakers in Germany, all over the place. Lots of different audiences that this applies to.
Yeah, for
And the
sure. I mean,
most
I
important.
think I just you because
Go ahead.
you inspired me. I was looking at some data, and you would think Argentina, Spain, Colombia, that these would be the countries with the second most Spanish speakers, perhaps after Mexico. But really, it's not. It's the
Sure.
USA. There's more Spanish speakers in the US, and a big opportunity for domestic inclusivity, right, by transiting into another language. So I totally like that you highlighted that it's not something we have to do to limit the talk of globalization or language really to
Right.
international. It's has a big deal to do with domestic assets and domestic factors as well.
For sure. We've got obviously a lot of research on that because that Spanish speaking group within the US is huge, actually. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting is that there are lots of different variations depending on the generations and which part of the audience. They may still want English for parts of it and Spanish for another. And
Mhm.
it's a really interesting thing to study within the domestic markets for a lot of countries. But whether it's domestic or international, what I'm going to say is really obvious, but organizations need a strategy, right?
Yeah.
um, we still see companies that kind of nibble around at the edges, and it's not that they don't know that they know that they need a strategy, but they just don't go through the discipline to do it. And so I think if you don't have a strategy, then what we see happening so often is that then the product fit isn't there. And we're not saying that a product has to fit every market perfectly in the world. But as you see that you all work really hard on the language, but if the product doesn't really fit the market that it's going into, that's where the big struggle comes. So strategy is really important to go, okay, where does this fit? Do we need to make changes? Where does language fit into here and all that? I think the second thing is also to prepare teams for this expansion. And we touched on that, under the first question, but you need to think about, okay, again, IT infrastructure. What
Hmm.
about our data security and all privacy across borders? Do we really have the right payment options, which is a typical one,
Yeah.
but still people don't get it right. Um, every team across an organization, even if it ends up they're not directly involved, maybe they won't have as many resources because they're being put into international. So in other words, the teams really need to be prepared, besides in addition to the language support teams and stuff. So the last one is my favorite, actually. And it's hard to do. And I think a lot of companies, and that's why a lot of companies either don't do it or actually don't even realize it. And that is, okay, no matter how good your strategy is, no matter how good your product fit is, no matter how good Motion Point is at doing, the localization piece, if you don't have your employees within your organization tied, their objectives, their KPIs, their metrics, their OKRs, whatever you want to call it, if those aren't tied in some way to international performance, then it's never going to get there. People will be heroic, they'll do what they can, but if they don't have the resources to do what they need, that's really, really key. So for
Yeah.
example, when these questions apply to international marketing, a big one that we see, in fact, I just worked with a company this week. They do all this work on SEO, right? But are they ready for international? Do they know what they're doing?
Yeah.
No. And so all the work that they did on translating all this content, if people can't find it, that's really important that be tied to performance objectives within a company.
Yeah,
That's a big
that's
one.
super true. I think that that's a really good best practice to think about. Um, we see something in parallel with Motion Point as well, where it's um, the things that hold back the most. Let's say taking a new website that's been translated live into the market is, setting at the smallest level, what's the glossary, what's the style guide, like how are you going to decide to
Mm-hmm.
merchandise your internal lingo, your products, your brand voice into global
It's
markets.
huge.
And that's something where a company or a translator in this industry that touches applications, or it's an LSP, whatever it is, that they all have to
Mm-hmm.
go through. But the approval has to come from a customer or a client there, right? And that's not something that the service provider should be prescribing. They should be getting that
Mhm.
style guidance officer. And it's similar to what you're talking about, like setting a strategy, because just translating your website, or translating a brochure, that's not truly doing. There's no strategy behind that. That's more of a tactic. And when you
No.
when you don't really
Yeah.
think things through, and what I mean by that is, like, how is it going to fit with the rest of the puzzle, right? You
Mhm.
see, like, subpar results, and also, you know there's no road to fix it, because there's no plan to look back at, if it's getting executed or
The
not.
way to measure it.
Yeah,
Exactly. And then people, and then an executive, rightly so, will go, well, we spent $500,000, or we spent $250,000, and we did this translation, and sure, we increased our sales by a little bit, but like it was supposed to be magic.
yeah,
And it can be magic. But you've got to have certain pieces in place, and you have to be organized about it. Yeah. But
yeah,
again, Dominic, as you know, it's just a business process. I mean, doing all of this is a business process, and that's the key. How do you integrate that into an organization's way of doing business when it hasn't been part of their DNA? So that's why people like me still have jobs. I shouldn't, Dominic. This should really be easy for people. I shouldn't have to tell people how to do this, but it's not quite as easy as it looks from the side. All right.
absolutely.
Last question.
Last question. So, I mean, we kind of touched on it, but I'll ask it anyway. It's, what are some
Uh-huh.
potential risks, or pitfalls associated to, multilingual marketing, language translation, and
Mhm.
is there any research or stories that could illustrate, the impact, of something like that?
Sure. I think I did want to touch on the advantages even as well,
Okay,
which are
we
obvious,
can
right?
we can do that.
Yeah, I think those are obvious, but I want to remind people, no matter what size you are, at some point, if you're really good at what you do and people like your product and or your service, you will run out of enough customers in your own market. So where do the next 1,000, the next 10,000, the next 100,000 customers come from? And it won't be your home market. So that's the advantage. I mean, at some point, you will need to do some kind of marketing, outside of your own market. But the disadvantage comes in that it requires an ongoing investment. It's not a
Yeah,
one and done thing. It's kind of like having a baby. I mean, in the sense that once you have a baby, you shouldn't kill it off. I mean, you can't kill it off, right? And the same
yeah,
thing with moving into a market or marketing. If you start and someone, people do know about your brand and then you pull it, that is not a good thing. So that's, I think, maybe not. I mean, it's a risk, right? Not a disadvantage, but really recognizing that it's an ongoing investment that you need to make that changes over time, I think.
yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
the reason I kind of asked, more about the disadvantages first, because we spoke a lot about, advantages in some ways, but
Mhm.
I'm very much aligned with that, because what you're doing when you go into a new market is committing to that market, and it's very delicate to your brand reputation if you were to just, take the rug from underneath that market, and stop serving it. And you're right. I like the analogy of a baby,
Yeah.
because you can start small, but you have to nourish it, and it has to
Yeah.
keep on growing. It has to
Mhm.
keep on getting better. You can't just disregard.
Exactly.
Yeah. Were you going to add anything else, Rebecca?
Well, no, but I was going to say too, just like a baby, things will change around it, right? The environment's going to change. So an assumption you made when a child was 2 is not the same as when the child is 3 and 4. So the same thing with
Yeah.
marketing. The stuff's going to change, and you need to pay attention. And things that worked last year might not work this year. So, yeah, all those things to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the other parts. What are the trends in the market you're serving? What's the, change in buying behavior?
Mhm.
It really is,
Exactly.
people, marketers and businesses and executives spend a lot of time talking about something like, what's the ideal customer persona? What's the profile, right? And these things, they spend hours and hours of time and resources in for their flagship market, and they have to do the same thing for their multilingual markets, right? For their global markets, their
Or at least a
secondary
certain
markets, and their
percentage of that.
domestic.
And but
Yeah,
on the flip side, right. And On the flip side, though, I think especially US companies still sometimes don't realize that certain markets are really looking for a US or an American experience, no matter what global politics are, no matter what's happened. And so I think maybe companies are getting better at realizing, okay, we don't have to make as many changes as we thought. Yes, we definitely need to translate and localize our code and the website and get all that right, but the experience may not need to change as much as they think. So that's what makes our field exciting, is because it's never the same. Each company and each market is
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, we call it here internally, we call that the balance between customization and standardization. There's points that you can keep the
Yeah,
same.
yeah,
There's other parts that you can change, and finding that balance really does make it, like you're right, unique to every company. Nobody's going to do it the same, and then that's pretty neat.
exactly, exactly. So you asked for some success stories. I don't have actually, we within our research we do, but I don't have one I want to point out, but I want to point out kind of a bigger picture thing. And what we
Yeah,
find out is that with global marketing and translation and localization in general, that the more that it can be tied to an overall corporate initiative, the more successful it's apt to be. So, for example, whether it has to do with AI these days, whether it has to do with customer experience, I don't know. Maybe a company has a procurement initiative that they're trying to save money or do certain things with vendors or quality. What's really great about the translation in global marketing is that it is a horizontal function. As we said, the Achilles heel means that causes problems, but
right.
it also means that you can almost always tie it to an initiative in some way. There's going to be an international perspective or a marketing perspective to almost anything. So that what we see, the most successful stories and the most successful companies, usually those teams, it's always a part of whatever the overall corporate objectives are over time.
Yeah.
And that's key. Yeah, that's what we
Yeah,
find.
well, that kind of wraps up what you were saying at the beginning, where it has to be part of the KPIs and the key
Mhm.
objectives of a company, and it sounds like
Exactly.
what you're seeing is, well, that's because the proof is in the pudding. The companies that are actually making it part of their entire strategy and marrying their multilingual markets into their KPIs, their OKRs, their global
Sure.
yearly objectives, right? Like, they're more successful. So absolutely, that totally makes sense for
Exactly.
sure.
Because there's a commitment. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. Is there anything else you would like to
So
add,
do we have to
Rebecca?
stop now? No, no. But I love talking about this, and it's great for companies such as yours who come in to actually look at the language part of it. You all end up educating companies many times to say, look, you all need to look bigger than just the language piece, and that's what is great about working with companies such as yours. So this has been fun. Invite me back sometime.
Absolutely, we sure will, Rebecca. And I appreciate your time. I really do appreciate you
Of
taking
course.
a part of your day to do this. So that does it for three questions with Motion Point. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time.